Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about delegating, the key to management.
Delegating is easy. All you have to do is make a list of tasks to complete and send it to your team, then let them organize the details.
Hardly, delegating is the most fundamental responsibility of a manager. So, what is delegating really? What's the story?
When it comes to delegating, there are three watchwords: autonomy, verification, and trust.
Let's start with the first term, autonomy. When you look closely, you'll see that delegating is about giving a third-party autonomy with respect to a certain topic.
I give you a responsibility which you accept. It's often expressed in targets, quantitative or otherwise, which describe the expected result.
You heard that right. You don't delegate a list of tasks, you delegate a responsibility. A responsibility for obtaining an agreed-upon qualitative and quantitative result.
This responsibility is framed by constraints which are also part of delegating, deadlines, budget, etc. Like with a contract, you make sure you know all of the terms and conditions before signing.
And don't turn to small print. When you delegate, you have to make things as clear as possible. Doing so prevents unpleasant surprises for both parties. You try to make everything explicit, the constraints, expectations, leeway, etc.
The delegatee needs a frame of reference to evaluate the nature and intensity of initiatives they can take, because within the framework, they are free to organize their efforts as they see fit.
They govern themselves within the agreed-upon framework. Freedom within prescribed limits is the very definition of autonomy.
But here's something to look out for. Delegating doesn't mean you're no longer responsible. This point brings us to our second term, verification.
For those of you who ascribe to benevolent and positive management strategies, verification does not counteract that benevolence. Quite the contrary, actually. Verification is about ensuring that things are moving in the right direction via regular milestones.
It's not about judging or pointing fingers at the delegatee. It's about working with them to check in on where they are with respect to the goal and trying to help them by asking questions and providing guidance or an outside opinion.
This is feedback in the purest sense, assessing work and results. And you can't wait until the end of the project. When it comes down to it, nothing is more benevolent than periodic check-ins when they're done right.
The frequency and level of detail of the check-ins will depend on both the nature of the project and the constraints it's facing,
as well as on mutual trust. Trust is the third watchword.
Trust is underpinned by several things: the person's abilities, attitude, values, and more,
as well as the manager's ability to let go. Both parties must trust the other and prove themselves worthy of trust, and that can be a real challenge.
And for those who might be thinking, why bother? Let's not forget the old saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. When it comes down to it, delegating isn't about saving time right here, right now. It's about building a project together long term.
And you can never lose sight of that project. To make it a success, there are tasks to share out. The manager is responsible for organizing who will do what to ensure efficiency. And this eventually translates to delegating.
Organizing the work to be done requires you to address each delegation. You can't just throw the responsibility to the group and wait for someone to volunteer.
Being a manager also requires a certain dose of teaching skills. When you delegate, you should explain the meaning behind it. In other words, you explain the link between the responsibility you're giving the person and the project you're working collectively to accomplish.
And if there is no link, or it's hard to explain, then you need to go back to the drawing board and modify the delegation and the task itself.
Sometimes delegating is an opportunity to help someone grow in a particular field. You don't always delegate to an incredibly competent expert. Sometimes you delegate to someone who doesn't have all of the required skills, but who has shown they are willing to learn and progress.
But you don't leave them to fend for themselves. You adjust the frequency and level of detail contained in check-ins accordingly.
To recap, delegating is about handing responsibility for an expected result to an employee who accepts. You have to outline the expected result with room for autonomy and set up regular check-ins in line with the level of trust between you. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.